August 29, 1526, a waterlogged plain near the village of Mohács in southern Hungary. 25,000 Hungarian soldiers, their armour glinting in the afternoon sun, stood arrayed in 2 lines across the marshy ground. Behind them, the young King Louis II, barely 20 years old, watched as Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon. What the Hungarians could not have known, what their commanders failed to grasp until it was far too late, was that they were about to face something unprecedented in European warfare. Not just an army, not just superior numbers, but a weapon system that would revolutionise combat and end their kingdom in an afternoon. The sound of 200 muskets firing in coordinated volleys, row after row, a mechanical thunder that European armies had never encountered in battle. This is the story of when medieval Hungary collided with the future of warfare and lost everything. To understand what happened at Mohács, we must first understand what had been lost. 36 years earlier, in 1490, Hungary had possessed perhaps the most formidable military force in Central Europe. The Black Army of King Matthias Corvinus, a professional standing force of 28,000 men, mostly cavalry and infantry, had defeated the Ottoman Empire in 15 separate engagements. They won 13 of those battles outright. This was not a feudal levy. This was a modern army by the standards of the late 15th century, paid professionals drawn from across Europe. Czechs, Germans, Serbs, Poles and Hungarians, all drilled in coordinated tactics, equipped with the latest weapons including early firearms and artillery, organised into disciplined units under experienced commanders. The Black Army's infantry used pavises, large shields that could be planted in the ground to create mobile fortifications. Behind these shields, crossbowmen and early arquebusiers could fire with relative safety. The cavalry included both heavy knights in full plate armour and light horsemen, hussars who could skirmish and pursue with equal effectiveness. This combined arms approach, integrating infantry, cavalry and artillery into a unified system, had made Hungary a military power that even the Ottomans respected. But when Matthias Corvinus died in 1490, everything changed. The Hungarian nobility, who had chafed under the taxation required to maintain a standing army, disbanded the Black Army almost immediately. They wanted to stop paying the extraordinary taxes. The professional soldiers were dismissed, the weapons were dispersed, the training systems collapsed. Hungary reverted to a traditional feudal military structure, relying on noble cavalry levies and poorly trained peasant infantry. By 1526, this decision had proven catastrophic. The Hungary that faced Suleiman the Magnificent was a hollow shell of its former military might. The kingdom had been weakened by internal divisions, by a peasant revolt in 1514 that had been brutally suppressed, leaving the countryside resentful and the peasantry disarmed by law. The nobility was fractured into competing factions. The young King Louis had inherited a realm where powerful magnates often refused to follow royal commands, where border fortresses went undermanned and undersupplied, where the great military traditions of the past had been abandoned for short-term financial relief. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman had been systematically preparing for this moment. Suleiman had become Sultan in 1520 at age 25, succeeding his father Selim I, who had more than doubled the size of the empire through conquest. From the beginning of his reign, Suleiman had his eyes on Central Europe. In 1521 he captured Belgrade, the great fortress that had held out against Mehmed II in 1456. With Belgrade in Ottoman hands, the road to Hungary lay open. There were no major fortifications, no strong defensive line between Belgrade and the Hungarian capital of Buda. For 400 kilometres along the Danube, the border was essentially undefended. The Hungarian nobles, still not grasping the scale of the threat, failed to adequately garrison the few remaining border castles. Petrovarat fell to the Ottomans in July 1526 due to chronic lack of garrison troops. Each fortress that fell meant the Ottomans could advance further with impunity. The strategic situation was shaped by European politics far beyond Hungary's borders. King Francis I of France had been decisively defeated by Holy Roman Emperor Charles V at the Battle of Pavia in February 1525. After months in prison, Francis was forced to sign the Treaty of Madrid, ceding territory and agreeing to humiliating terms. But Francis had no intention of honouring these terms. In a watershed moment of European diplomacy, he formed a formal alliance with Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The Franco-Ottoman alliance, which would last for 3 centuries, was designed to relieve Habsburg pressure on France. Francis explicitly asked Suleiman to make war on the Holy Roman Empire, and the road from Ottoman territory to the Holy Roman Empire led directly through Hungary. Suleiman's ambitions and Francis's request aligned perfectly. Hungary would be the first target in a campaign that the Ottomans hoped would eventually reach Vienna itself. On April 23, 1526, Suleiman left Constantinople at the head of a massive army. Contemporary sources estimated his total force at 100,000 men, though the actual combat strength deployed at Mohács was probably between 45 and 60,000. But numbers alone don't tell the story. What mattered was the composition and organisation of this army. At its core were the professional troops that made the Ottoman military the most formidable fighting force of the age. The Janissaries, elite infantry recruited through the Dev Shurm system, the levy of Christian boys from Balkan provinces who were converted to Islam and trained from childhood as professional soldiers. By 1526, there were between 7,000 and 10,000 Janissaries in the Ottoman army. These men were not part-time soldiers or feudal levies. They were career warriors who drilled constantly, who lived in barracks, who were forbidden to marry before age 40 or engage in trade. Their complete loyalty to the Sultan was expected and generally given. The Janissaries were paid regular salaries, given regular food rations, and enjoyed higher status than most Ottoman subjects. In return, they were expected to fight with absolute discipline and to master their weapons with professional skill, and their primary weapon had evolved. By 1526, the Janissaries were equipped with tufenks, matchlock firearms that Western sources usually translate as muskets or arquebuses. These weapons had been in Ottoman service for decades, but their use had become increasingly sophisticated. Ottoman military logistics for the 1526 campaign were staggering. Records show that the army transported 4,000 small guns and 60 larger trench guns for the Janissaries and other infantry. This meant that roughly half of the Janissary corps could be armed with firearms at any given time. These weren't primitive hand cannons. These were matchlock weapons with standardized calibers. Archaeological evidence from the Mohács battlefield shows clear peaks in projectile diameters, corresponding to Ottoman 4 and 5 dirhambor sizes, 13 and 14 millimeters respectively. This standardization meant that ammunition could be mass-produced and distributed efficiently. The Ottoman army carried its ammunition with it. The Janissaries didn't need to cast their own bullets in the field. But the real innovation wasn't the weapons themselves. It was how the Janissaries used them. And this is where we need to understand something that would prove decisive at Mohács. The Ottomans had developed a system of volley fire, a coordinated method of employing matchlock weapons that no European army had yet used in a major field battle. The technique as described in Ottoman sources, 200 tufenks formed 9 consecutive rows. The soldiers fired their weapons row by row, in a kneeling or standing position, without the need for additional support or rest. This was revolutionary. Individual matchlock weapons were slow to reload. A single musketeer might fire once per minute under ideal conditions. But by organising musketeers into multiple rows that fired in sequence, the Ottomans created continuous fire. The first row would fire and immediately begin reloading. The second row would fire while the first reloaded. The third row would fire while the first and second reloaded. By the time the 9th row fired, the first row was ready to fire again. This created an unbroken stream of projectiles, a wall of lead that no charging cavalry could penetrate. This wasn't theory. The Janissaries had practiced this technique extensively. They drilled constantly in the use of their firearms. Contemporary accounts describe how the Sultan personally observed Janissary training exercises. The discipline required for effective volley fire was extraordinary. Each row had to fire simultaneously on command. Each soldier had to reload at the same pace as his fellows. The rows had to maintain their positions and not break formation under the stress of combat. This level of coordination could only be achieved through professional training and strict discipline. European armies in 1526 relied primarily on feudal levies and noble cavalry. They didn't have the organisational structure or training systems to implement such tactics, even if they had understood them. The Dutch would develop similar volley fire techniques in the 1590s, 70 years after Mohács, but in 1526 this was Ottoman innovation, and the Hungarians had no idea what was coming. The Ottoman artillery was equally formidable. Suleiman's army transported 300 cannons of various sizes. These ranged from massive siege guns to smaller field pieces that could be moved with the army and positioned quickly. Ottoman artillery included the feared trench guns, massive weapons firing 80mm balls that were described by enemies as terrifying. The logistical achievement of moving 300 cannons across the Balkans and into Hungary cannot be overstated. The Ottomans had constructed pontoon bridges across the Danube's tributaries, the Sava and Drava rivers, in advance of the campaign. These bridges, built by military engineers who travelled with the army, allowed the massive Ottoman force with its artillery train to cross rivers that would have halted a less organised army. The 5-day crossing of the Drava River alone, accomplished without opposition because Hungarian forces were too scattered to contest it, demonstrated Ottoman engineering and organisational superiority. Supporting the janissaries and artillery were the Sipahis, the Ottoman cavalry. These were provincial cavalry, holders of land grants who were obligated to provide military service. The Sipahis were experienced horsemen, well equipped with bows, swords and lances, capable of rapid movement and devastating charges. They formed the mobile strike force that could exploit any breakthrough created by infantry and artillery. The Ottoman army also included azarbs, irregular infantry, and akinjis, irregular light cavalry who were compensated through plunder. These troops were less disciplined than the janissaries and sipahis, but they added numbers and could be used for scouting, foraging, and pursuing broken enemies. The entire force was commanded by Suleiman himself, with his Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha leading the vanguard and overseeing tactical operations. This was a well-organised military machine with clear chains of command, experienced leadership and proven tactical systems. Now contrast this with what Hungary could field. King Louis II had issued a general summons for troops in the spring of 1526, but the response was slow and incomplete. The harvest had to be completed before men could be spared. Foreign mercenaries coming from abroad set out only during the summer. The great magnate János Zápolyai, voivode of Transylvania and one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, refused to bring his Transylvanian army to join the king. Whether this was deliberate treason, poor judgment, or simple slowness is still debated by historians. What is certain is that Zápolyai's army of several thousand men was still at Szeged, well away from Mohács, when the battle was fought. His absence would prove critical. Other reinforcements from Bohemia, paid for by Bohemian and Moravian nobles, were still marching toward Hungary when the battle occurred. They would arrive in Buda at the end of the summer, too late to affect the outcome. The army that Louis was able to assemble numbered between 25,000 and 30,000 men. This was not insignificant. Contemporary sources noted that no other Western European country could have summoned a larger force in a single muster. France, with similar territory but larger population, fielded armies of comparable size. But the composition of the Hungarian army revealed its weaknesses. Roughly half were infantry, and about half were cavalry. The cavalry included both heavy armoured knights and light horsemen, hussars who fought with lance and sabre. The heavy cavalry, nobles fighting in full plate armour on armoured horses, were the traditional strength of Hungarian armies. These knights expected to decide battles through shock charges, the massed impact of armoured horsemen crashing into enemy formations. This had worked for centuries against various opponents. The Hungarian cavalry had earned a fearsome reputation across Europe, but tactics that had succeeded against other feudal armies would prove inadequate against Ottoman combined arms doctrine. The Hungarian infantry was more problematic. About half were arquebusiers, soldiers armed with matchlock weapons similar to those used by the janissaries. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield shows that Hungarian troops did have firearms. Arquebus barrels dated to between 1450 and 1480 have been found, along with bullet moulds and projectiles. But here's the critical difference. The Hungarian army lacked standardized calibers and centralized ammunition supply. Individual soldiers or small units cast their own bullets using their own moulds. The variety of projectile sizes found at Mohács, with peaks around 11 to 12 millimeters quite different from the Ottoman standards, suggests that Hungarian firearms came from different sources and different countries. Mercenaries from Germany, Poland, Bohemia and Croatia brought their own weapons with their own specifications. There was no unified supply system, no standardized training, and most critically, no doctrine for coordinated volley fire. Hungarian arquebusiers were expected to fire individually at targets of opportunity, not in disciplined ranks on command. The Hungarian army also had 85 cannons, a respectable number that actually exceeded what most Western European armies deployed. But these were lighter field pieces compared to the massive Ottoman artillery train. and the Hungarian gunners lacked the experience and coordination of their Ottoman counterparts. The Hungarian military structure remained fundamentally based on noble leadership and individual valour. Units were organised around particular nobles who brought their own retainers. There was limited central coordination. The army was hastily assembled and had not trained together. Many of the soldiers had little combat experience. While Hungary had been fighting small border skirmishes with the Ottomans for years, most of the Hungarian army had never faced a major Ottoman field force. They were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between raiding and formal battle. The Hungarian leadership was also problematic. King Louis was 20 years old, well-meaning but inexperienced. The actual military command fell to Pál Tomori, Archbishop of Kalocsa and governor of the southern border. Tomori was a capable commander who had fought the Ottomans before and understood the threat. He reportedly advised Louis to withdraw northward to Buda, to buy time for reinforcements to arrive, to avoid battle until the army was stronger, but the Hungarian magnates, the great nobles whose political power rested on their military reputation, insisted on giving battle immediately. They feared that retreating without fighting would demoralize the country. They believed that their heavy cavalry could break the Ottoman lines as Hungarian knights had broken so many armies before. They wanted glory, and they convinced the young king to attack. So on August 29, 1526, the Hungarian army waited on the plain of Mohács. They had chosen the ground carefully. The battlefield was bounded by marshes and wetlands that would protect their flanks and limit Ottoman manoeuvrability. The Hungarian formation was arrayed in two lines. The first line put mercenary infantry and artillery in the centre, with heavy cavalry on both flanks. This was sound tactical thinking. The infantry and guns would receive the Ottoman attack and break it up, while the cavalry wings could charge and envelop the enemy. The second line consisted of levy infantry and reserve cavalry, positioned to exploit any success or cover any retreat. It was a reasonable deployment given traditional Hungarian tactics, but it was designed to fight a traditional European battle, a battle of cavalry charges and infantry combat. It was not designed to face what was coming. The Ottomans arrived and deployed with professional efficiency. Suleiman positioned his army in a crescent formation, with the janissaries and artillery in the centre, Sipahi cavalry on the wings. The Ottoman centre was designed to receive and absorb the Hungarian cavalry charge, to slow it down with firepower, to disorganise the Hungarian formations. The cavalry wings were positioned to envelope any Hungarian units that penetrated the centre or to attack the Hungarian flanks once the centre held. This was combined arms doctrine perfected through decades of Ottoman warfare. Every unit had a specific role. Every commander knew the plan, and the firepower component, the massed janissary musketry and the artillery barrage, was designed to do something that no European army could match in 1526, to create a killing zone that cavalry could not cross. The battle began in the early afternoon. There was initial skirmishing as light cavalry from both sides probed for weaknesses. Then the Ottomans opened fire with their artillery. 300 cannons began bombarding the Hungarian positions. The noise would have been tremendous, a rolling thunder that shook the ground. Cannonballs ploughed through the Hungarian ranks. Men and horses were torn apart. The Hungarian artillery responded, 85 guns firing back, but they were outmatched in both number and weight of shot. The artillery duel went to the Ottomans quickly. As the guns fired, the janissaries moved forward in disciplined ranks. 200 musketeers formed their 9 rows. They advanced to effective range, probably between 100 and 200 yards from the Hungarian infantry. Then they knelt. Then they fired. The first volley tore into the Hungarian centre. 200 musket balls, 13 to 14 millimetres in diameter, travelling at high velocity, struck the Hungarian mercenary infantry almost simultaneously. Men fell screaming. Armour was penetrated. The survivors had barely processed what had happened when the second row fired, then the third row, then the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth rows. In the space of perhaps 30 seconds, the Hungarian centre had absorbed 1,800 musket balls. This was unprecedented. Individual arquebusiers firing at will might hit a few targets, but this was concentrated, continuous fire. The Hungarian infantry, already shaken by the artillery bombardment, began to waver. Some tried to return fire, but they were individual shooters against coordinated volleys. It wasn't a contest. The Hungarian commanders recognized that their infantry could not stand against this firepower. They did what Hungarian armies had always done. They ordered the cavalry to charge. The heavy cavalry on both wings spurred their horses forward. These were the cream of the Hungarian nobility, men in the finest armour mounted on powerful war horses, lances levelled, a mass of steel and horseflesh thundering across the plain. For a few moments it seemed like it might work. The sheer momentum of several thousand armoured knights charging in formation was terrifying to witness. The Hungarian right wing, the section commanded by Archbishop Tomori himself, smashed into the Ottoman left with devastating force. They broke through the Ottoman Rumeli cavalry. They pushed forward, routing enemy units, getting close to the Ottoman centre where Suleiman himself was positioned. For a moment the Hungarians had broken through. Tomori's men came so close to Suleiman that the Sultan was reportedly struck in the chest by an arrow. It hit his cuirass, his armoured chestplate, and did not penetrate, but it demonstrated how close the Hungarians came to an impossible victory. But then the reality of Ottoman firepower asserted itself. The Janissaries turned their muskets on the cavalry. The disciplined volley fire that had shattered the infantry now targeted the mounted knights. Horses were shot out from under their riders. Knights in armour were knocked from their saddles by multiple musket balls. The artillery, repositioned quickly by experienced Ottoman gunners, fired directly into the cavalry formations at close range. Canister shot, essentially large shotgun blasts of metal fragments, tore through the charging horsemen. What had been an organised charge became chaos. Wounded horses screamed and fell. Knights in heavy armour, dismounted in muddy ground, could barely move. The Ottomans, who had momentarily fallen back before the Hungarian charge, reformed and counterattacked. The Sipahi cavalry, fresh and organised, struck the Hungarian flanks. The Janissaries advanced, still firing in volleys, still maintaining their discipline, and began to surround the Hungarian penetration. On the Hungarian left wing the situation was even worse. The Ottoman cavalry had attacked the Hungarian infantry there with overwhelming force. The infantry, already weakened by artillery and musket fire, broke quickly. The Ottoman horsemen poured through the gap and swept around behind the Hungarian lines. The Hungarian army was being enveloped. The cavalry that had charged so bravely found itself surrounded, taking fire from multiple directions, unable to retreat. The Hungarian second line, seeing the first line disintegrating, began to break. Panic spread. What had been an army became a mob. Soldiers threw down their weapons and ran. The marshes that were supposed to protect the Hungarian flanks now became death traps. Men fleeing into the wetlands found themselves stuck in mud and water, unable to escape, cut down by pursuing Ottoman cavalry, or drowned under the weight of their armour. King Louis II tried to escape with the remnants of his army. Accounts differ on exactly what happened. The most commonly accepted version is that his horse slipped while crossing a small stream called the Seal. The young king, wearing heavy armour, fell into the water. The weight of his armour dragged him down. He drowned in a creek, unable to save himself, his bodyguards unable to reach him in time. Other accounts suggest he was thrown from his horse and killed in the fall. What is certain is that Louis died during the retreat. His body was found days later, recovered from mud or water, and the news of his death meant the end of the Jagiellonian dynasty in Hungary. With the king dead and no heir, a succession crisis was inevitable. The battle lasted only about 3 hours. In that time, the Hungarian army was destroyed. Casualties were horrific. Contemporary sources reported that 14,000 Hungarian soldiers were killed, including about 1,000 nobles. Another 2,000 prisoners were executed after the battle on Suleiman's orders, a brutal demonstration of Ottoman victory. Among the dead were 28 principal barons, 500 other nobles, 7 bishops, and Archbishop Tomori himself, who fell fighting with his troops. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was the decapitation of the Hungarian aristocracy. The men who governed the kingdom, who commanded its forces, who made its political decisions, died on that waterlogged field. The Hungarian kingdom lost almost its entire leadership class in 3 hours. Ottoman casualties were relatively light. Sources estimate between 1,500 and 3,000 Ottoman soldiers killed. Given that the Ottomans probably fielded between 45 and 60,000 men, this was a loss rate of around 3 to 5%. The Hungarians lost more than half their army. This disparity tells us everything about the effectiveness of Ottoman tactics. The combination of artillery bombardment, coordinated musket volleys, and cavalry envelopment had turned what should have been a difficult battle into a massacre. and the Ottomans had done it while suffering minimal losses themselves. Suleiman was reportedly astonished when he surveyed the battlefield. He had expected to face the full military strength of Hungary. The fact that only 30,000 men had been sent against him suggested that the Hungarians had either badly misjudged Ottoman strength or had been unable to mobilise fully. Either way, it indicated that Hungary was far weaker than anyone had realised. The immediate aftermath of Mohács was almost as devastating as the battle itself. Suleiman marched on Buda, which surrendered without resistance. Queen Mary, Louis's widow, fled before the Ottomans arrived. The city was looted despite Suleiman's orders to the contrary. The famous Corvinus Library, one of the great collections of Renaissance manuscripts in Europe, was taken to Constantinople. The royal treasury was seized. 2 trophy cannons that the Hungarians had captured from Mehmed II 70 years earlier, when Belgrade held out against the Ottoman siege, were recovered and sent back to Constantinople as symbols of Ottoman revenge. The Ottomans burned Mohács itself. The Akingis, irregular cavalry who were paid through plunder, were unleashed across the countryside. They pillaged villages, burned crops, captured civilians to be sold as slaves. Contemporary sources reported that over 100,000 Hungarian captives were taken during the campaign and marched back to Ottoman territory. But Suleiman did not stay in Hungary. He had achieved his immediate objective, the destruction of Hungarian military power. But it was late in the campaigning season. His army had been on the march since April. Supplies were running low. The logistics of occupying Hungary permanently would require establishing new supply lines, garrisoning cities, leaving enough troops to hold conquered territory against rebellion or Habsburg intervention. Suleiman decided to withdraw. He left Buda in September and marched his army back to Constantinople, arriving in triumph. From his perspective, the campaign had been a complete success. He had destroyed Hungary's army, killed its king, plundered its capital, and demonstrated Ottoman military superiority. If he wanted to come back and conquer the rest of Hungary, nothing could stop him. And this was the beginning of a catastrophe that would reshape Central Europe for 2 centuries. With King Louis dead and no heir, 2 rival claimants emerged for the Hungarian throne. János Zápolyai, the Transylvanian magnate whose failure to bring his army to Mohács made some suspect him of treason, was elected king by one faction of Hungarian nobles. Ferdinand of Austria, Louis's brother-in-law and a member of the Habsburg dynasty, was elected king by another faction. Both men were crowned, both claimed to be the legitimate king of Hungary, and both sought foreign support. Zápolyai, driven into exile when Ferdinand's troops defeated him in the ensuing civil war, turned to Suleiman for help. He became an Ottoman vassal. Suleiman recognized him as king and promised military support in exchange for tribute and loyalty. This gave Suleiman the perfect excuse to return to Hungary. In 1529, Ottoman troops re-entered the country, defeated Ferdinand's forces, and reinstalled Zápolyai as a puppet king in Buda. From then on, Ottoman soldiers remained in Buda, and Hungary's independence was effectively over. The kingdom was divided into 3 parts. Royal Hungary in the west, ruled by Ferdinand and the Habsburgs. Ottoman Hungary in the centre, directly administered by the Sultan with a pasha governing from Buda. And the Principality of Transylvania in the east, nominally independent but actually an Ottoman vassal state. This tripartite division would persist until 1699, when the Treaty of Karlowitz finally drove the Ottomans out of most of Hungary. For 173 years, Hungary was a battlefield and a border zone, its people caught between Ottoman and Habsburg armies, its territory devastated by constant warfare, its population reduced by combat, famine, and disease. But our focus is on the military revolution demonstrated at Mohács. What made the Ottoman victory so complete? Superior numbers were part of it. The Ottomans probably had a 2-to-1 advantage in troops, but many battles throughout history have been won by smaller forces against larger ones. Numbers alone don't explain what happened. The real answer lies in the combination of professionalism, organisation, and firepower that the Ottomans brought to bear. The Janissaries were professional soldiers. They trained constantly. They drilled in the use of their weapons until those weapons became extensions of their bodies. They understood discipline, how to maintain formation under pressure, how to follow orders in the chaos of combat. They had officers who had fought in previous campaigns, who understood tactics, who could make decisions quickly. This professionalism gave them an enormous advantage over the hastily assembled Hungarian levy infantry. The Ottoman command structure was centralized and efficient. Suleiman was the supreme commander, but he delegated tactical command to experienced officers like Ibrahim Pasha. Orders flowed down a clear chain of command. Units knew their roles and executed them. The coordination between artillery, infantry and cavalry, the way each arm supported the others and exploited the opportunities created by the others, this required practice and planning. The Ottomans had both. The Hungarians, by contrast, had a decentralized command structure where noble commanders acted with considerable independence. This could work when everyone agreed on the plan and understood their roles. But at Mohács, with the young, inexperienced king, competing factions among the nobility, and an army thrown together from different sources, the lack of unified command meant the Hungarian response to Ottoman tactics was improvised and uncoordinated. But the decisive factor was firepower. The coordinated volley fire demonstrated by the Janissaries at Mohács was something that European armies would not master for another 70 years. The Dutch under Maurice of Nassau would develop similar techniques in the 1590s. The Swedish under Gustavus Adolphus would perfect them in the 1620s. But in 1526 this was uniquely Ottoman, and it changed the equation of battle completely. Traditional medieval warfare assumed that cavalry charges could break infantry formations. Armoured knights could scatter foot soldiers through sheer momentum and shock. This had been true for centuries, but massed musketry changed that. A cavalry charge, no matter how brave or well armoured, could not survive continuous fire. Horses would be shot, riders would be killed or wounded, the formation would break up under casualties. By the time the survivors reached the enemy infantry, if they reached it at all, their momentum and cohesion would be gone. They would be individual riders against disciplined ranks, and they would be slaughtered. This is what happened to the Hungarian cavalry at Mohács. Their charge, which should have been their greatest strength, became a death sentence. They rode into a storm of lead. The Janissaries had created a killing zone that could not be crossed by men on horseback, and once the Hungarian cavalry was destroyed, the infantry and second-line formations collapsed quickly. The Hungarians had no answer to Ottoman firepower. Their own arquebusiers, firing individually, couldn't generate comparable volume of fire. Their artillery was outnumbered. Their cavalry, their traditional decisive arm, proved vulnerable to muskets and cannons. The tactical system that had served Hungarian armies for generations was obsolete, rendered irrelevant in 3 hours by a more modern way of war. The contrast with what Hungary had possessed 36 years earlier is heartbreaking. The Black Army would not have faced these problems. It was a professional force with trained infantry, coordinated tactics, and experienced leadership. It had defeated the Ottomans repeatedly, but the nobility had disbanded it to save money, and now the price of that decision was the destruction of the kingdom. This is a lesson that repeats throughout military history. Professional soldiers cost money to train and maintain. It's tempting to cut military spending during peacetime, to rely on cheaper militia or feudal levies. But when crisis comes, when you face a professional enemy, the cost of that false economy becomes apparent. Hungary saved money by disbanding the Black Army. Hungary lost its independence at Mohács. The long-term impact of Ottoman firearms doctrine extended far beyond Hungary. The demonstration of effective volley fire at Mohács was observed and reported. European military writers began to discuss the need for infantry firepower and disciplined formations. The gradual shift in European armies from cavalry-dominated forces to infantry-dominated forces, from reliance on shock tactics to reliance on firepower. This process was underway before Mohács, but the battle accelerated it. By the mid-16th century, Spanish tercios, squares of pikemen protecting arquebusiers, dominated European battlefields. By the early 17th century, Swedish and Dutch armies had developed linear tactics with multiple ranks of musketeers firing in controlled volleys. The age of the armoured knight was ending. The age of infantry firepower was beginning, and Mohács was one of the critical demonstrations that drove this transition. The Ottomans themselves continued to refine their tactics. By 1605, during the Long War with the Habsburgs, there are clear descriptions of Janissaries using Western European-style volley fire with rotating ranks. Some historians debate whether the Ottomans invented volley fire independently or learned it from European examples and then perfected it. But the evidence suggests that at Mohács in 1526 the Ottomans were ahead of European practice. They had developed and deployed coordinated musketry in a major field battle before any Western army did the same. This was partly because they had a professional infantry corps, the Janissaries, who could be trained to the necessary level of discipline. It was partly because Ottoman military culture emphasized practical effectiveness over traditional forms. The Ottomans were willing to innovate, to adopt new weapons and new tactics if they worked. European armies, dominated by noble cavalry who had cultural and political reasons to resist the rise of infantry firepower, were slower to change. There's also the question of how much the Ottomans were influenced by others. Some scholars suggest they learned volley fire techniques from observing Chinese firearms use or from reading Chinese military manuals through intermediaries. Others argue that the Ottomans developed the technique independently based on their own experience with firearms. The truth is probably that multiple cultures discovered similar solutions to the same problem. How do you maximize the effectiveness of slow-loading matchlock weapons? You organize shooters into multiple ranks that fire in sequence. This isn't a single invention, but a logical tactical evolution that different armies arrived at through experience. What matters is that the Ottomans had this figured out by 1526, and they used it to devastating effect at Mohács. Archaeological work at the Mohács battlefield continues to reveal details about the battle. In recent years, systematic excavations have uncovered grave sites with over 150 skeletons. Analysis of the remains shows cause of death. Many have injuries consistent with bladed weapons, swords and lances. Many have blunt force trauma from maces or axes. But a significant number have injuries from projectiles, including musket balls. The distribution of finds, including hundreds of deformed impacted bullets showing fierce firefights, confirms that there was intense exchange of fire in certain areas. The bullet molds found on the battlefield, used by soldiers to cast ammunition, tell us about the logistics of firearms use. The Ottoman forces with standardized calibers and centralized ammunition supply could sustain fire longer. The Hungarian forces casting bullets individually with varied molds were at a disadvantage in any prolonged exchange. The psychological impact of massed musketry should not be underestimated. Imagine being a Hungarian soldier in that infantry line. You've been bombarded by artillery for an hour. Cannonballs have killed men around you. The noise is incredible, disorienting. Then you see Ottoman infantry advancing in perfect ranks. They kneel. You hear a roar like continuous thunder, and men all around you fall screaming. Before you can process what's happening, another roar, more men fall, then another roar, then another. This isn't like facing individual archers or crossbowmen where you can see the projectiles coming and might dodge. This is sudden, mechanical death. The man next to you simply collapses with a hole in his chest. You don't know where the shot came from. You can't see the individual musket that killed him. It's impersonal, overwhelming, terrifying in a new way. This is industrial warfare imposed on medieval soldiers. They had no mental framework for it. They broke. The Hungarian nobility, those who survived, never forgot Mohács. The battle entered Hungarian historical consciousness as a national trauma. For centuries afterward, Hungarians would refer to more than was lost at Mohács as an expression meaning complete catastrophe. The date, August 29th, became a day of mourning. The battlefield became a memorial site. In 1976, the Hungarian government established a formal memorial encompassing much of the battlefield. Visitors can walk the ground where the armies clashed, where the Hungarian kingdom died. There are monuments to the fallen, to King Louis, to the nobles and common soldiers who fought and died in those 3 hours. It's a sombre place, windswept and flat. The marsh is still visible, and you can almost imagine the formations arrayed across the plain, the thunder of the Ottoman artillery, the crash of the cavalry charge, the screams of the dying. From the Ottoman perspective, Mohács was a great victory, but not the end of their campaigns in Europe. Suleiman would return multiple times. He besieged Vienna in 1529, though he failed to take the city and had to withdraw. He campaigned in Hungary again in 1541, establishing permanent Ottoman control over central Hungary. He died in 1566 during yet another campaign in Hungary, still trying to push further into Europe. The Ottomans would reach their maximum extent in Europe in 1683 when they besieged Vienna a second time. But that siege failed, and the failure marked the beginning of Ottoman decline. The technologies and tactics that had given them advantage, professional infantry with firearms, artillery, coordinated combined arms operations, these were now matched or exceeded by European armies. The balance of power was shifting. but in 1526 at Mohács, that shift was still a century away. On that August day, the Ottomans demonstrated a level of military professionalism and firepower that the Hungarians could not match. The sound of 200 Janissary muskets firing in coordinated volleys was something that European ears had never heard on a battlefield. It was the sound of the future, the mechanization of death, the replacement of individual skill and bravery with organized industrial violence. The Hungarian heavy cavalry, for centuries the decisive force in their military system, charged into that sound and was destroyed. Medieval warfare met early modern warfare, and medieval warfare lost. Within 3 hours, a kingdom that had stood for 500 years was broken. Within a few years, that kingdom had ceased to exist as an independent state. And it was firepower, coordinated massed musketry supported by artillery and professional troops, that made the difference. The Hungarians learned at Mohács what other European armies would learn in the coming decades and centuries. The age of armoured knights deciding battles through valour and shock was ending. The age of disciplined infantry firepower was beginning, and those who failed to adapt would be swept away. The lesson of Mohács spread slowly through Europe, carried by survivors, by observers, by the reports of merchants and diplomats who witnessed the aftermath. But understanding what had happened and implementing changes based on that understanding were two different things. European military establishments were conservative, resistant to change, dominated by social classes whose power rested on traditional forms of warfare. The armoured knight was not just a military unit. He was a symbol of social order, a justification for noble privilege, a cultural ideal celebrated in literature and art. To admit that massed infantry firepower could render knights obsolete was to threaten the entire social structure of European feudalism. So the lesson was learned slowly, reluctantly, often only after repeated defeats forced recognition of reality. The Spanish were among the first to grasp the implications. Their tercios, the famous Spanish infantry squares that dominated European battlefields from the 1520s through the 1580s, combined pikemen and arquebusiers in formations designed to deliver both shock and firepower. The pikemen protected the shooters from cavalry charges, while the arquebusiers provided the killing power. This combined arms approach at the infantry level was similar to what the Ottomans had achieved with their janissaries, though the Spanish developed their system somewhat independently. By the 1540s, Spanish tercios were demonstrating that well-trained infantry with firearms could defeat cavalry charges, could hold ground against overwhelming odds, could project power across Europe. But even the Spanish, with their early adoption of firearms doctrine, took decades to fully implement the kind of coordinated volley fire that the janissaries had used at Mohács. Individual soldiers firing at will remained the standard practice in Spanish armies until late in the 16th century. The French, despite their alliance with the Ottomans, were even slower to adapt. French military culture remained dominated by the heavy cavalry tradition. French nobles saw themselves as knights, and the idea of dismounting to fight on foot with firearms was beneath their dignity. It took the Italian wars and repeated bloody encounters with Spanish tercios to force changes in French military thinking. By the 1570s, France was recruiting and training infantry armed with arquebuses in larger numbers, but the integration of these troops into effective combined arms formations came slowly. French military theorists wrote about the need for disciplined infantry firepower, but translating theory into practice required changes in training, organisation, and above all in the social attitudes that determined who could command and how warfare should be conducted. The Holy Roman Empire, which included the Habsburg domains directly threatened by Ottoman expansion, had the most immediate need to learn from Mohács. Ferdinand of Austria, who claimed the Hungarian throne after Louis's death, spent the next decades fighting the Ottomans along the Hungarian border. His armies gradually adopted firearms in greater numbers and began to develop tactics for using those firearms effectively. The military frontier, the Militär Grenz, established along the border with Ottoman territory, became a testing ground for new weapons and tactics. German mercenaries, the Landsknechts, began to include larger numbers of arquebusiers in their ranks. By mid-century, a typical Landsknecht regiment might be half pikemen and half arquebusiers, with the shooters deployed in ranks that could deliver sequential fire. This wasn't yet the systematic volley fire that would characterize 17th century warfare, but it was moving in that direction. The real breakthrough in European adoption of coordinated firepower came in the 1580s and 90s during the Dutch revolt against Spanish rule. Maurice of Nassau, Prince of Orange and commander of the Dutch rebel forces, faced a critical problem. His army was smaller than the Spanish forces he opposed, and he lacked the veteran heavy cavalry that dominated traditional European warfare. What he did have was money from Dutch merchants and access to military theorists who had studied classical texts and contemporary accounts of Ottoman warfare. Maurice and his cousins, particularly William Louis of Nassau, systematically redesigned Dutch infantry tactics based on Roman discipline and Ottoman firepower principles. They drilled their soldiers constantly, teaching them to load and fire in coordinated sequence. They organised musketeers into ranks, with each rank firing in turn while the others reloaded. They developed a system where soldiers could maintain continuous fire by rotating through positions. The key innovation was discipline and repetition. Maurice's men practiced the complex series of movements required to load and fire a matchlock musket until they could perform them without thinking, even under the stress of combat. They practiced maintaining formation and following commands. They practiced firing on command rather than at individual discretion. This level of training required time and money, but the Dutch were willing to invest both. The result was infantry that could deliver sustained firepower comparable to what the Janissaries had demonstrated at Mohács 70 years earlier. When Maurice's reformed infantry faced Spanish tercios at the Battle of Newport in 1600, they demonstrated the effectiveness of the new system. The Dutch musketeer ranks fired in continuous sequence, pouring lead into the Spanish formations, disrupting their cohesion and eventually breaking their lines. Swedish King Gustavus Adolphus took these Dutch innovations and refined them further in the 1620s during the 30 Years' War. He reduced the depth of infantry formations from 10 ranks to 6, then to 3, allowing more soldiers to fire simultaneously. He improved the rate of fire through better training and lighter muskets. He integrated artillery directly into infantry formations, creating mobile gun batteries that could move with the troops and provide immediate fire support. He emphasized aggression and offensive action, training his infantry to deliver devastating volleys and then charge with cold steel before the enemy could recover. The Swedish brigades that smashed imperial armies at Breitenfeld and Lutzen were the culmination of the firepower revolution that had begun at Mohács. Professional disciplined infantry, using coordinated musketry to dominate battlefields. But while European armies were slowly learning these lessons, the Ottomans were beginning to stagnate. The Janissary Corps that had been so innovative in the early 16th century became increasingly conservative by the early 17th century. The Devshirme system that had provided recruits was gradually abandoned. Janissaries were allowed to marry and pass their positions to their sons. They became a hereditary caste, more concerned with protecting their privileges than maintaining their military effectiveness. They resisted attempts to modernize their weapons or tactics, viewing any changes as threats to their traditional status. When Ottoman sultans tried to introduce new military units trained in European tactics, the Janissaries rebelled, assassinating reformist sultans and blocking changes. The Ottoman military system that had been so effective in 1526 was ossifying, becoming a barrier to modernization rather than an engine of military innovation. By the late 17th century, when Ottoman and Habsburg armies clashed in Hungary again during the Great Turkish War of 1683 to 1699, the balance had shifted. European armies now had firepower and discipline equal to or exceeding Ottoman forces. At the Battle of Vienna in 1683, Polish cavalry under King Jan Sobieski broke the Ottoman siege with a massive charge, but it was the sustained musket fire from imperial infantry that had weakened the Ottoman positions and made that charge possible. At the Battle of Zenta in 1697, imperial forces under Prince Eugene of Savoy destroyed an Ottoman army attempting to cross the Tisa River, killing 30,000 Ottoman soldiers while suffering minimal losses themselves. European armies were now using the concentrated firepower, tactics that the Ottomans had pioneered, and using them more effectively than the Ottomans themselves. The cycle had completed. The students had surpassed the teachers. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 forced the Ottomans to cede most of Hungary to Habsburg Austria. After 173 years of Ottoman occupation, Hungary was liberated, though it now belonged to the Habsburgs rather than being independent. The Mohács battlefield, which had been in Ottoman territory for nearly 2 centuries, was now in Habsburg Hungary. The site of Hungary's greatest defeat became a symbol of eventual redemption, proof that military power was temporary, that empires rose and fell, that the balance of power constantly shifted. But the military lessons of Mohács remained valid. Professional training mattered. Coordinated tactics mattered. Firepower, properly organised and systematically employed, could decide battles and change history. Modern historians studying Mohács have access to sources that were unavailable to earlier generations. Ottoman archives open to Western scholars in the 20th century reveal detailed accounts of the campaign from the Ottoman perspective. Archaeological excavations have provided physical evidence about weapons, casualties, and the exact location of various phases of the battle. Computer modelling and terrain analysis have allowed reconstruction of how the battle unfolded, confirming some traditional accounts and challenging others. What emerges is a picture more complex than simple narratives of Ottoman superiority versus Hungarian backwardness. The Hungarians were not incompetent. Their commanders understood warfare as it had been practiced for centuries. Their soldiers were brave. Their heavy cavalry was genuinely formidable when employed under the right conditions. What defeated them was not personal failing but systemic disadvantage. They brought a feudal military system to fight a professional one. They relied on traditional tactics against innovative ones. They faced coordinated firepower with individual valour. Under those circumstances, defeat was nearly inevitable. Could the Hungarians have won at Mohács? Counterfactual history is always speculative, but we can identify decision points where different choices might have led to different outcomes. If János Szápolyai had brought his Transylvanian army to join King Louis, the Hungarian force would have been perhaps 40,000 strong rather than 25,000. That would have altered the numerical balance significantly. If the Hungarian commanders had followed Archbishop Tamori's advice and withdrawn to Buda to wait for reinforcements from Bohemia and other allies, they could have assembled a larger army and forced Suleiman to fight further from his supply bases later in the season. If the Hungarians had maintained the Black Army after Matthias Corvinus's death, they would have faced the Ottomans with professional troops trained in modern tactics rather than feudal levies. Any of these changes might have prevented or postponed the disaster, but the deeper structural problems would have remained. Hungary in 1526 was a medium-sized kingdom with perhaps 4 million inhabitants, divided by internal rivalries, weakened by recent peasant rebellions, lacking the financial resources to maintain large standing armies. The Ottoman Empire at the same time had perhaps 15 million subjects, controlled vast wealth, maintained professional military forces that numbered in the tens of thousands, and could mobilize resources across 3 continents. Even if Hungary had won at Mohács, even if they had defeated Suleiman's first invasion, the Ottomans could have returned with another army the next year and the year after that. The fundamental imbalance of power meant that Hungary's independence was probably doomed, unless they could find powerful allies willing to commit substantial forces to their defence. And in 1526, with the Habsburgs fighting France and dealing with the Protestant Reformation, with Poland focused on its eastern borders, with no European power able or willing to send armies to defend Hungary, the kingdom was isolated and vulnerable. This raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between military power and political survival. Hungary had been a significant European power in the 15th century under Matthias Corvinus, its armies defeating Ottoman invasions and expanding Hungarian territory. But that military power rested on financial resources extracted through taxation and the political will to maintain professional forces even during peacetime. When Matthias died and the nobility disbanded the Black Army to reduce their tax burden, they gained short-term financial relief but sacrificed long-term security. The money they saved in the 1490s they paid 1,000-fold in the 1520s and beyond, in looted wealth, burned villages, enslaved populations, and ultimately the loss of independence. This pattern repeats throughout history. Societies that invest in military preparedness during peacetime may survive crises that destroy societies that prioritize short-term savings over long-term security. The lesson is harsh, but clear. Military power must be maintained continuously, not improvised when crisis arrives. The human cost of Mohács extended far beyond the casualties on the battlefield. The Ottoman conquest of central Hungary brought decades of warfare, with Habsburg and Ottoman armies fighting back and forth across the territory, devastating the countryside repeatedly. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, populations displaced or killed. the inhabitants of central Hungary endured nearly 2 centuries of being caught between competing empires, both of which treated Hungarian territory as a battlefield and Hungarian resources as prizes to be exploited. Estimates of population loss vary widely, but some historians suggest that Hungary's population may have declined by as much as 50% between 1526 and the end of the 17th century due to warfare, famine, disease, and emigration. An entire society was traumatized, its development arrested, its cultural and economic progress halted for generations. For the Ottomans, Mohács represented the high watermark of their expansion into Central Europe. Suleiman never succeeded in conquering Vienna despite 2 major sieges. The logistics of projecting power deep into Central Europe, far from Ottoman supply bases, proved difficult even for the well-organized Ottoman military system. As European armies adopted Ottoman firepower tactics and developed their own innovations, the military advantage shifted. By the mid-17th century, Ottoman armies were no longer superior to European forces. By the late 17th century, they were increasingly outmatched. The empire that had seemed unstoppable in 1526 was in retreat by 1700. The reasons were complex, involving internal politics, economic stagnation, failure to modernize, and the changing balance of global power. But part of the story was military. The Ottomans had revolutionized warfare with their use of coordinated infantry firepower. Then they stopped innovating while their enemies learned and adapted. The innovators became conservatives, and conservatism in military affairs is often fatal. The firearms that decided the outcome at Mohács continued to evolve rapidly throughout the 16th and 17th centuries. Matchlock weapons gave way to wheel-lock mechanisms, then flintlocks, each generation more reliable and faster to fire. Standardization of calibers and parts became universal in professional armies. Manufacturing techniques improved, making weapons cheaper and more accurate. By the early 18th century, European infantry were armed with smoothbore flintlock muskets that could be loaded and fired 3 to 4 times per minute by well-trained soldiers, double the rate of matchlock arquebuses from Mohács. The tactics for employing these weapons had evolved as well, with linear formations replacing the deep blocks of earlier eras, allowing maximum firepower from every soldier. The age of gunpowder had fully arrived, and it would dominate warfare until the 20th century. Artillery technology advanced even more dramatically. The massive siege guns that took weeks to position in 1526 gave way to lighter, more mobile field pieces that could be moved during battle to support infantry attacks or counter enemy advances. Standardization of calibers, improvements in metallurgy, and better gunpowder allowed cannons to fire faster and more accurately. By the Napoleonic era, artillery had become the dominant arm in European warfare, capable of destroying infantry formations at ranges that muskets could not match. Napoleon famously called artillery the Queen of Battles, and his success rested largely on his innovative use of concentrated artillery fire. But the roots of that artillery-dominated warfare can be traced back through centuries to battles like Mohács, where Ottoman gunners demonstrated how firepower could decide outcomes. The memorial complex at Mohács today includes a museum displaying artifacts recovered from the battlefield. Visitors can see the musket balls, both Ottoman and Hungarian, that killed men nearly 500 years ago. They can examine pieces of armour, sword fragments, and other remnants of the battle. There are displays explaining the tactical situation, showing the positions of the armies, describing what happened and why. It's a place of pilgrimage for Hungarians, a reminder of national tragedy but also of resilience. Hungary survived despite Mohács. The culture persisted despite centuries of foreign occupation. The language and identity endured. That survival, against such odds, is perhaps as significant as the military defeat. Nations can lose battles and wars but survive if the people refuse to surrender their identity. Hungary is testament to that truth. For military historians, Mohács remains endlessly fascinating because it represents a transition point, a moment when 2 different military systems clashed and demonstrated conclusively which approach was more effective. The evidence from the battlefield, confirmed by contemporary accounts and modern archaeology, shows that Ottoman firepower tactics were decisive. This wasn't about numbers alone or leadership or courage, it was about military systems, about the effectiveness of professional training versus feudal improvisation, about coordinated firepower versus individual valour. These are lessons that remain relevant today. Modern militaries still debate the balance between technology and training, between firepower and maneuver, between innovation and tradition. The questions raised at Mohács continue to be asked and answered differently in each generation. The sound of those Janissary volleys, the mechanical thunder of 200 muskets firing in sequence, echoed far beyond the marshes of southern Hungary. It was heard in Spanish tercios forming squares in Flanders. It was heard in Dutch rebel armies drilling in coordinated musketry. It was heard in Swedish brigades marching to victory in Germany. It was heard in British redcoats firing volleys at Blenheim and Waterloo. It was heard in American Minutemen standing against British regulars at Bunker Hill. The principle demonstrated at Mohács that organised firepower delivered by disciplined troops could dominate battlefields became the foundation of modern warfare. From matchlock muskets to rifled firearms to automatic weapons to precision-guided munitions, the technology changed but the principle remained constant. Whoever could deliver the most effective fire on target would win. Mohács was an early demonstration of that eternal truth. King Louis II, who died, fleeing from the battlefield at age 20, became a tragic figure in Hungarian history and literature. Poets wrote about his death, his youth cut short, his kingdom destroyed. He was remembered as a well-meaning young man thrust into an impossible situation, facing enemies too powerful and problems too complex for anyone to solve. His death symbolized the end of an era, the final collapse of medieval Hungary. But he was also blamed by some for fighting when he should have retreated, for listening to proud nobles who wanted glory rather than wise advisors who counselled caution. The truth is probably that no decision Louis made on that August day would have changed the ultimate outcome. Hungary's problems ran deeper than any single battle. The kingdom's fate was sealed by decades of internal division, by the disbanding of the Black Army, by the absence of reliable allies, by the massive power imbalance between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Louis was simply the unfortunate ruler who happened to be on the throne when the bill came due for all those earlier mistakes. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled for 46 years, the longest reign of any Ottoman sultan. He campaigned personally in 13 major wars across 3 continents. He expanded Ottoman territory to its greatest extent, from Budapest to Baghdad, from Algeria to the Red Sea. He reformed Ottoman law, patronized arts and architecture, oversaw a golden age of Ottoman culture. He was called Suleiman the Lawgiver by his own people, and Suleiman the Magnificent by Europeans who feared and admired him. He died in 1566 during yet another campaign in Hungary, his body transported back to Constantinople for burial. His legacy was an empire at the height of its power, a military machine that dominated the Mediterranean and threatened Central Europe, a cultural achievement that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe or Asia. And his first great military triumph in Europe, the victory that opened Hungary to Ottoman conquest, was Mohács. That battle, won with coordinated firepower and professional military organisation, demonstrated the methods that made his empire so formidable. It also demonstrated the vulnerability of European powers that clung to outdated military systems. Suleiman understood what his Hungarian opponents learned too late, that warfare was changing, that the age of armoured knights was ending, that the future belonged to whoever could best organise and employ gunpowder weapons. At Mohács, the future defeated the past, and Central Europe paid the price for generations.